Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Rain pressed softly against the long glass panels of the University Innovation Lab, tracing thin silver lines down toward the concrete courtyard 5 floors below. Most of the building had gone dark hours earlier, but a single workspace near the back still glowed with the pale blue light of multiple monitors. Elias Arden Vale sat hunched forward in a chair that squeaked every time he shifted his weight, his eyes fixed on a cascade of numbers flowing across the screen. The program he was writing wasn't meant to impress professors or earn grades. It was meant to predict human mistakes. Not emotions, not intentions. Mistakes. Patterns of behavior that always appeared just seconds before people compromised a system without realizing it. He barely noticed the coffee beside him had gone cold. Across the room, a girl dragged 2 chairs together and sat backwards on them, chin resting on the top rail as she watched him for several minutes before speaking. "You've been staring at that line for 10 minutes, she said. "Either it's broken or you're waiting for it to apologize." Elias didn't turn. "It's not wrong. It's incomplete." Mara Keene smiled faintly. She had learned that tone meant his mind was mapping connections faster than he could articulate them. She studied architecture but preferred the lab because the quiet here felt honest. No small talk, no competition posturing, just people building things that didn't exist yesterday. "You skipped dinner again," she said. "Not hungry." "You said that yesterday." He finally leaned back, rubbing his eyes. "Most security systems react after a breach. I'm trying to make one that acts before intent forms. Not prediction. Anticipation." He gestured to the code. "Everyone leaves behavioral fingerprints before they do damage. Hesitation in cursor movement, abnormal timing patterns, irregular data access sequences. The system should recognize the decision forming in real time." Mara tilted her head. "So? It stops people before they do something wrong." "It gives them a chance not to," he corrected quietly. She didn't respond immediately. She knew Elias long enough to recognize the difference. He wasn't building control, he was building prevention. To him, mistakes were tragedies waiting for interruption. Outside, thunder rolled far away. "Come to my family dinner tomorrow," she said gently. "My dad thinks anyone who codes at 2 in the morning must either be a genius or a criminal." Elias almost smiled. "What does he think I am?" "He said he'll decide after dessert." For a moment, the lab felt warmer than the glow of machines should allow. Elias saved his work, not realizing the foundations of a company, and a catastrophe, had just taken their first breath. 3 years later the garage smelled like solder and cardboard boxes. Servers lined the walls in improvised racks, each one labeled in careful handwriting. The system had evolved beyond anything Elias imagined in university. Adaptive security architecture capable of identifying threats before execution. Businesses that tested it reported breaches dropping to nearly 0. He didn't celebrate that statistic, he studied it. Perfect systems didn't exist. Only systems not yet challenged. Dominic Vale stepped inside carrying takeout containers and speaking loudly into his phone before ending the call. "I'm telling you, investors love a story," he said, setting the food down. "And right now our story is young visionary founder changes cybersecurity forever. That sells." Elias didn't look up from a diagnostic panel. "It works. That should be enough." "Not in markets." Dominic opened a container and pushed it toward him. "Perception builds valuation. Valuation builds power." Their younger brother Rowan sat cross-legged on the floor assembling packaging kits for the first small batch of clients. He watched them quietly the way he always did, absorbing more than he spoke. Numbers, interactions, tone shifts. He catalogued details instinctively. Their sister Lila leaned against the doorframe scrolling her phone. "Your company name still sounds like a medical condition," she muttered. "Neurodyne Systems. What does that even mean?" "It means adaptive cognition modeling," Elias replied. "It means you need branding help." Victor Vale entered last, coat still on despite the warmth inside. He surveyed the equipment, expression unreadable. A former corporate attorney, he evaluated everything through liability and control. "You incorporated correctly," he said to Elias. "But governance structure is weak. Too much authority rests in a single executive position." "It's my company." Victor's gaze lingered a moment too long. For now, yes. But organizations outgrow founders who refuse structure. Margaret Vale followed with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. She placed napkins beside the food as if staging a photograph. Your father means stability protects success. Elias nodded without argument. He believed results spoke louder than caution. Across the room, Rowan quietly wrote the date on a shipping log. He would remember this conversation later. The first time ownership sounded like a debate rather than a fact. The first real office overlooked a river lined with winter trees. Snow clung to the banks while inside the conference room sunlight reflected off glass walls and polished floors. Investors listened as Dominic presented growth projections with confident rhythm, pacing naturally, hands moving just enough to emphasize certainty. He was good at this, translating Elias's quiet precision into excitement. Elias spoke only when questions demanded accuracy. He explained the system's learning model, how it adapted to user behavior without storing personal data, how predictive prevention reduced liability risks for corporations handling sensitive information. The room shifted from polite interest to focused attention. Afterward, Harold Whitmore shook his hand firmly. "You're not selling software," the older man said. "You're selling relief. Companies will pay almost anything for fewer disasters." Mara stood near the doorway listening, pride soft in her eyes. She had joined as facilities coordinator at first, organizing spaces, schedules, logistics, but gradually became the person employees went to when work blurred into exhaustion. She understood Elias differently than others did. He wasn't chasing wealth. He was chasing the elimination of preventable harm. That night they stood on the office balcony overlooking the dark river. "You should celebrate," she said. He watched the city lights flicker across water. "Every system fails eventually. You built one that helps people avoid failure." He considered that quietly. Then it has to be protected from the people closest to it too. She laughed softly. "You trust strangers more than family." "I trust patterns," he answered. He didn't realize how prophetic that sentence would become, or how the most dangerous anomaly in his life would wear his own last name. The company expanded faster than the office could contain it. Desks multiplied in careful rows, glass meeting rooms appeared where empty space once echoed, and the hallway whiteboard filled daily with deployment schedules across 3 continents. Neurodyne Systems didn't advertise aggressively. It spread through quiet panic. One bank avoided a breach competitors suffered, then another requested installation, then a hospital network credited the software with stopping a ransomware attempt minutes before activation. Each success made Elias less visible publicly and more essential privately. He preferred it that way. Yet inside the company, control shifted subtly. Dominic handled interviews, partnerships, and press. Investors gravitated to him. He remembered names, birthdays, golf preferences. Margaret began visiting weekly under the guise of helping organize administrative policy, gradually inserting recommended hires for finance oversight. Victor drafted governance amendments to protect shareholders, documents Elias skimmed between system updates. He trusted efficiency. Paperwork bored him. Rowan alone noticed signature authority clauses changing language. Not illegal, just expandable. One evening he approached Elias' office holding a folder. "You should read these fully," he said quietly. Elias kept typing. "Dad wouldn't add anything harmful." Rowan hesitated. "It's not harm. It's leverage." Elias finally looked at him. "We're family." Rowan didn't argue further. He placed the folder on the desk and left, unease lingering behind him like a draft from an open window. Months passed. The company prepared its largest contract yet, integration with a multinational infrastructure group requiring real-time predictive monitoring across transportation networks. The system would transition Neurodyne from innovative startup into industry backbone. Pressure intensified. Dominic thrived in it. Lila began appearing at corporate events, introducing herself as creative consultant despite having no defined role. She disliked being the founder's sister and insisted on relevance. Mara noticed tension first during a launch celebration. Lila drank too quickly, laughing sharply at minor comments, repeatedly mentioning how the company's success belonged to the family as a whole. When an employee congratulated Elias directly, Lila's smile thinned. Later on the balcony she confronted him. "You never would have made it without us." "I didn't say that." "You act like this is yours." "It is mine," he replied gently, confused rather than defensive. Her eyes hardened, hurt transforming into resentment. "We carried you before anyone cared." He studied her expression, searching for logic in emotional territory he navigated poorly. "We all benefit." But the answer satisfied neither of them. Inside, Dominic smoothly redirected conversations while Margaret watched from across the room, calculating, measuring public perception as if it were currency. That night Rowan logged company expenses and noticed large personal withdrawals labeled executive compensation, authorized under newly approved board provisions Elias barely remembered signing. Winter deepened when the accident happened. Snow fell thick enough to silence the road, muffling the city into a grey blur of headlights and reflections. Elias had been working late refining anomaly detection thresholds when Dominic called insisting he attend a family dinner celebrating the upcoming contract signing. Reluctantly, he drove across town. Lila insisted on driving everyone home afterward despite drinking. Victor objected mildly. Margaret avoided conflict. Dominic shrugged. Elias offered to call a driver. Lila refused, offended. The car moved through slick streets, conversation tense but contained. Halfway across a bridge her phone buzzed. She glanced down too long. Tires lost traction. The vehicle spun, metal struck railing, airbags exploded in white shock. Everything stopped. Paramedics, sirens, snow turning to slush beneath flashing lights. Elias emerged shaken but conscious. Lila screamed in panic more than pain. Later at the hospital, doctors spoke quietly to Margaret in a side room while Victor filled insurance paperwork with unusual calm. By morning the narrative had changed. Police informed Elias witnesses reported shouting inside the vehicle before the crash. Lila, pale and trembling, told officers he had grabbed the wheel during an argument. Margaret cried softly. Dominic confirmed tension earlier that evening. Victor advised cooperation for clarity. Elias stared at them, unable to process the synchronized story forming around him. "I didn't touch the wheel," he said. No one met his eyes. The investigation accelerated unnaturally fast. Dashcam footage appeared showing abrupt steering consistent with interference from the passenger side, grainy but convincing. Lila, tearful, told authorities she'd recently discovered she was pregnant and believed the impact caused the loss. Sympathy surged around her. Media framed the story as tragic family conflict fueled by controlling tech founder. Mara tried visiting, but Margaret insisted Elias needed rest from outside stress. His calls went unanswered. Rowan attempted to speak privately, yet Victor remained present in every conversation. During interrogation, the detective slid photographs across the table. Witnesses heard raised voices. "We were talking," Elias said. "Your sister says you were angry about company decisions." "I wasn't." "You understand the seriousness. Reckless endangerment, potential manslaughter had circumstances differed." Elias realized facts mattered less than narrative cohesion. Every piece aligned against him with rehearsed precision. Court proceedings moved swiftly. Expert testimony supported the altered footage. Character witnesses described Elias as brilliant but obsessive. Lila wept describing fear for her unborn child. He watched his own life rewritten in past tense while his family sat united across the aisle. The verdict arrived on a quiet afternoon. Guilty. The transport bus to Oakwood Correctional Facility smelled of cold metal and disinfectant. Snow blurred the windows just as it had the night everything fractured. Elias counted passing mile markers unconsciously, mind seeking structure inside collapse. Anger didn't come. Confusion didn't either. Only a single question repeated. Why? Processing was efficient. Personal items catalogued. Shoes exchanged. Door closed. Inside the cell block, noise replaced courtroom silence, voices, footsteps, distant televisions. His assigned cellmate, Darius Cole, watched him with experienced evaluation. "You look like someone who still thinks explanations fix things," Darius said. Elias sat on the lower bunk. "They should." Darius shook his head. "Here truth isn't what happened. It's what holds together." That night Elias lay awake staring at the ceiling, reconstructing every conversation leading to the crash. Patterns emerged slowly: document changes, financial shifts, coordinated testimony. The probability of coincidence approached zero. If the narrative trapped him, the system behind it could also be mapped. The next morning he requested access to the prison library. Arthur Penrose, the librarian, noticed quickly that Elias didn't read to escape but to dissect. Legal procedure manuals, forensic accounting texts, behavioral psychology studies. He consumed structure, not story. Weeks became months measured in routines. He exercised at the same hour, studied case law at the same table, recorded dates in a small notebook Darius called his countdown ledger. "What are you building?" Arthur asked one evening. "A correction," Elias replied. Outside, Neurodyne thrived publicly under Dominic's leadership. Inside, Elias charted ownership transfers, tracked news articles, memorized every legal avenue for reopening a case. Anger hardened into discipline, colder, sharper, patient. Every day lost became a unit of calculation. And for the first time since the verdict, he understood something with absolute clarity. The story that destroyed him had structure, which meant it also had weaknesses. Oakwood had a rhythm the outside world never noticed. Doors opened at predictable seconds, footsteps echoed in repeating cycles, conversations followed patterns shaped by routine rather than meaning. Elias treated it like a living data set. Every day at breakfast the same guard paused near the far table to adjust his radio. Every Tuesday a supply cart arrived 5 minutes late. Every third Thursday a visiting attorney caused administrative backlog that delayed internal mail review. None of it mattered individually. Together, it formed structure. Darius watched him fill another page in the small notebook. "You planning an escape?" "No," Elias said calmly. "I'm planning accuracy." Arthur Penrose began reserving research materials before Elias requested them. Their discussions shifted from legal definitions to interpretation, how testimony fractures under contradictory financial incentives, how insurance liability pressures alter statements, how digital evidence could be altered without leaving obvious artifacts if corruption occurred before timestamp authentication. Elias absorbed it all. He wasn't trying to prove innocence emotionally. He was learning to dismantle certainty mathematically. One afternoon a newspaper arrived mentioning Neurodyne's pending $50 million infrastructure contract. Dominic stood smiling beside investors. Margaret appeared in the background. Lila avoided cameras entirely. Elias folded the page once and placed it inside his notebook. For the first time since sentencing, his expression changed, not anger, not pain. Resolution. Months passed into the final year of his sentence. Rowan's name appeared unexpectedly on a visitor request. When he entered the visiting room, he looked thinner, older in a way stress carves into posture rather than face. They sat across the glass partition. "I can't stay long," Rowan said quietly. "They think I came to check on you out of obligation." Elias waited. Rowan slid a legal pad toward the barrier where it could be read but not taken. Numbers filled the page, transfer dates, account identifiers, shell corporation registrations. "I started reviewing internal finances after everything. I thought it was just consolidation. It wasn't." Elias scanned the patterns instantly. Money moved through layered entities before returning as executive bonuses and consulting fees. "You're risking a lot." "I already did the day I stayed silent," Rowan replied. His voice shook. "I didn't know they'd go that far. The footage. Dad had someone alter it before police collected it. Lila panicked after the crash. Mom turned it into a narrative. Dominic believed it was temporary until things stabilized." "Why now?" Elias asked. Rowan swallowed. "Because they're about to sign something that locks this permanently. And I can't live knowing I helped erase you." A guard announced visiting time ending. Rowan stood but didn't leave immediately. "I kept copies. Not at home." For the first time, Elias felt something beyond calculation, not forgiveness, not yet, but a variable he hadn't accounted for, fracture within the system itself. Release came quietly. No family waited outside the gates. Instead a black sedan idled near the curb. A woman stepped out, coat collar lifted against the wind, posture confident without display. Cassandra Klein extended a hand. "I represent individuals interested in correcting institutional errors," she said. "You filed 3 legal information requests from prison. Most people don't cite precedent in handwritten forms." Elias shook her hand. "You read them." "I recognized design," she replied. "You weren't appealing emotionally. You were mapping process." Inside the car she placed a tablet before him showing financial charts already organized into preliminary litigation structure. "Someone sent anonymous documentation a week ago. I verified authenticity this morning. Rowan, Elias said quietly. Cassandra nodded once. If we move precisely. No public accusations yet. We apply pressure where concealment exists. The city looked unfamiliar as they drove, not because it changed, but because he had. Freedom didn't feel like relief. It felt like regained access to unfinished work. They didn't go home. They went directly to a private office where a second man waited among stacked audit files, Matteo Serrano. He studied Elias with open curiosity. I enjoy puzzles, he said. Your family built an elaborate one. He projected account movements across the wall. Funds diverted from Neurodyne through consultancy agreements approved after governance amendments. Signatures valid. Authority legitimate. Intent hidden. They didn't steal illegally, Matteo explained. They legalized the theft first. Then the correction must also be legal, Elias replied. Cassandra outlined Phase 1, regulatory audit triggers initiated through investor protection statutes. Not accusations. Compliance verification. Impossible to publicly oppose without suspicion. Phase 2, digital forensic reconstruction of original dashcam storage hardware. A third figure joined via video, Jun Park, forensic analyst. Corruption occurred before police acquisition, Jun said. Meaning alteration happened within private custody window. Victor. Elias felt the final piece align. He wasn't reclaiming a life. He was executing a system restore. Across the city, Dominic raised a glass during a pre-signing celebration with Harold Whitmore and potential partners. Margaret coordinated guest lists while Lila avoided conversation entirely, tension visible beneath rehearsed composure. Victor reviewed documents one last time, confident every vulnerability had been buried under legality. Morning arrived with simultaneous notifications. Financial regulators requested immediate review of Neurodyne's internal compensation channels prior to contract finalization. Whitmore postponed signing pending clarification. Media received anonymous tips questioning governance transparency. Inside a quiet office, Elias watched the first tremor ripple outward. He didn't call them. He didn't confront them. He simply initiated the process that forced truth to surface on its own timetable. The day he lost everything had been loud, sirens, accusations, verdicts. The day he began taking it back started almost silently. And this time, the narrative wouldn't belong to the loudest voice. It would belong to the undeniable one. The regulatory request didn't accuse anyone. That was what made it terrifying. It arrived as a formal compliance review, polite language, neutral tone, but attached to statutes investors rarely ignored. Neurodyne's legal department scrambled to compile internal compensation records, yet every file they submitted created new questions rather than answers. Consulting agreements routed through subsidiaries required justification. Executive bonuses linked to advisory entities required ownership disclosure. The more they clarified, the less coherent the structure appeared. Dominic spent 2 full days in conference calls, voice hoarse from reassurance he didn't entirely believe. Routine audit, he repeated to stakeholders. Standard scaling procedures. Harold Whitmore did not repeat it publicly. Instead, he postponed the signing indefinitely. Margaret sensed the shift before numbers proved it. Reputation, the currency she understood best, had begun fluctuating. Invitations withdrew subtly. Calls shortened. Her carefully maintained image no longer controlled perception. Uncertainty did. Victor requested a closed family meeting. They gathered in the penthouse dining room under evening light reflecting against the skyline. Lila sat rigid, hands clasped tightly. Rowan remained silent near the far end of the table. Victor placed printed documents down. Someone initiated this deliberately, he said calmly. And they understand our structure intimately. Dominic looked at Rowan first. Rowan held the gaze but said nothing. Margaret whispered, Elias. The name lingered in the room like a pressure drop before a storm. Cassandra refused to rush the next step. Truth collapses lies best when they defend themselves first, she explained while reviewing the company's public responses. Each statement Neurodyne issued tightened contradictions within internal filings. Matteo completed ownership tracing. Funds flowed through 5 shell corporations before returning to accounts controlled jointly by Victor and Margaret under Advisory Compensation Authority. Perfectly legal, until the original governance vote was examined. Elias's approval signatures existed but time-stamped during an investor dinner he physically attended elsewhere. Authentication relied on a device registered to his credentials. Jun reconstructed the dashcam data fragments. Original frames still existed beneath overwrite layers, partial, corrupted, but enough. Steering movement originated entirely from the driver's side seconds before impact. No passenger interference. Not proof yet, Cassandra said. But leverage. Elias watched each discovery without celebration. They built this assuming I would defend emotionally. You didn't, she said. I learned not to. The district attorney's office received an anonymous evidentiary submission, financial irregularities tied to sworn testimony in a prior criminal conviction. Not accusation. Referral. Simultaneously, Nina Hallberg published a restrained investigative article questioning how a predictive security company could experience internal oversight inconsistencies during executive transition. She named no suspects but quoted regulatory analysts noting governance anomalies following a founder's imprisonment. Public curiosity ignited. Dominic attempted a press response. Halfway through answering a question about executive authority changes, a journalist asked whether Elias had contested the conviction privately. Dominic hesitated 1 second too long. The hesitation circulated faster than any statement. Rowan arrived at Elias's office unannounced that night. I didn't expect this scale, he admitted quietly. I thought. Maybe legal review, maybe settlement. Elias looked at him for a long moment. You helped start the correction. Now it finishes. Rowan exhaled shakily. They are scared. They should be honest, Elias replied. Rowan nodded. I brought everything else. He placed a storage drive on the desk, private emails discussing narrative strategy after the accident, drafts of coordinated testimony language, Victor's instructions on maintaining consistency. Elias didn't touch it immediately. Once this enters court, Rowan said, voice tightening, there's no family left. Elias finally picked up the drive. There hasn't been for a long time. The petition to vacate conviction was filed at sunrise. It contained no dramatic language, only synchronized evidence, reconstructed video analysis, medical documentation confirming the pregnancy loss occurred weeks prior to the crash due to unrelated complications, financial motive linking perjured testimony to corporate control, and sworn affidavit from Rowan acknowledging knowledge of coordinated statements. By afternoon, prosecutors requested an emergency hearing. By evening, every network carried the headline, Conviction under review after new evidence emerges. Margaret watched the broadcast standing perfectly still in her living room. Victor read the filing twice without expression. Dominic called repeatedly without reaching anyone. Lila locked herself in her bedroom, unable to confront the memory she'd rehearsed into belief. In a quiet office across the city, Elias closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, not in triumph. Only in completion of the first phase. The truth had not yet won. But the lie could no longer stand without effort. The courthouse steps filled before sunrise. Reporters arrived first, then analysts, then spectators drawn by the gravity of a story that now carried equal parts scandal and fascination. A founder imprisoned. A family united in testimony. A corporation thriving during his absence. And now, evidence suggesting the entire foundation had been engineered. Inside, the courtroom felt smaller than Elias remembered. Not physically, emotionally. The same benches, the same seal behind the judge's chair, the same placement of prosecution and defense tables. Yet the air no longer pressed against him. This time he wasn't reacting to a narrative, he was presenting structure. Cassandra stood beside him reviewing the final filing order. They will resist chronology, she said quietly. So we control it. Facts before interpretation. Across the aisle, Victor's attorney reorganized binders with rigid precision. Margaret avoided looking toward Elias entirely. Dominic kept scanning the room as if searching for a version of events that still favored confidence. Lila sat pale, hands trembling in her lap. Rowan remained separate, seated behind the prosecution, not with either side, but with truth itself. Proceedings began. Jun Park testified first. Calm, technical, methodical. He explained data overwrite behavior, timestamp inconsistency, and reconstruction methodology. He didn't accuse, he demonstrated. Frame by frame, steering movement originated solely from the driver's side. The courtroom watched silent pixels dismantle certainty once accepted without question. Victor's attorney attempted to challenge interpretation. Jun replied simply, "Data cannot hold conflicting physical motions simultaneously." The judge allowed the evidence. The first pillar fell. Next came medical testimony. Hospital records confirmed the pregnancy complication occurred weeks before the accident. Time-stamped lab results contradicted the original narrative timeline. The prosecution carefully avoided emotional tone. They let sequence speak. Sympathy shifted from the grieving sister once portrayed to the imprisoned brother never heard. Lila's composure fractured. When asked to reaffirm prior testimony, her voice shook. She glanced toward Margaret, then Victor, searching for the same certainty that had guided her words years earlier. It wasn't there anymore, only consequence. "I believed it," she whispered. Cassandra did not attack. She only asked, "Who explained the sequence to you before police questioning?" Silence stretched. Finally, "My parents said panic could confuse memory." The second pillar cracked. Financial evidence concluded the structure. Matteo Serrano mapped funds across screens visible to the court. Compensation layers linked testimony timeline to corporate control transfer dates. Governance amendments executed during the investigation period benefited specific parties exclusively if Elias remained legally incapacitated. Motivation replaced speculation. Victor took the stand voluntarily, confidence worn like armor. He argued precaution, stabilization, protection of shareholder value. Not conspiracy, necessity. Cassandra waited before asking one question: why was the dashcam storage device accessed privately before police retrieval? For the first time, Victor hesitated. Not long. Just enough. And everyone saw it. The third pillar collapsed without another word. The ruling did not come immediately. Legal systems moved carefully when undoing their own conclusions. But by evening, the judge vacated the conviction pending full exoneration review and referred the case for criminal investigation into perjury and evidence tampering. Outside, cameras flashed as Elias stepped into open air once more, not released, but restored. He gave no statement. Not because he had nothing to say. Because the truth now spoke without him. Weeks later, charges were filed formally. Negotiations replaced denials. Dominic cooperated to avoid financial prosecution. Lila entered a plea acknowledging false testimony under influence. Margaret's social circle dissolved faster than legal proceedings. Victor maintained silence to the end, a strategist unwilling to narrate his own defeat. Rowan met Elias at the river overlooking Neurodyne's headquarters. "I didn't ask what happens now," Rowan said quietly. Elias watched the building lights flicker on floor by floor. "Now the company becomes what it was meant to be, independent of anyone's control, including mine." He handed Rowan a document. Shared oversight structure. Immutable governance. No single authority capable of repeating history. Rowan looked up. "You still trust me?" "I trust the person who chose truth when it cost everything," Elias answered. The first day back inside Neurodyne felt almost ordinary. Employees paused, uncertain whether to celebrate or remain professional. Mara stood near the entrance, eyes bright but steady. She didn't rush forward, she simply said, "Welcome back." He nodded. No dramatic reunion. Just presence restored. From his office window the city moved exactly as it had the day before the accident. Systems updated, servers hummed, people worked unaware of how close narratives had come to rewriting reality permanently. Elias opened a blank document and began designing oversight protocols ensuring authority required consensus, evidence required independent verification, and no story could imprison truth again. He didn't rebuild the past. He engineered a future resistant to it. And for the first time since the night snow blurred the road, the patterns ahead looked stable. The civil proceedings unfolded slower than the criminal referrals, but they carried weight of a different kind. Criminal court determined guilt. Civil court quantified damage. Cassandra approached it with the same discipline she had applied from the beginning. Not vengeance, not spectacle, but restoration through measurable loss. Elias sat through depositions without visible emotion while transcripts from 3 years prior were read aloud beside current sworn corrections. Words once delivered with certainty now sounded fragile, hollow when placed against authenticated evidence. Financial projections presented during his absence were compared with internal risk memoranda Victor had suppressed. Insurance claims filed after the accident were dissected line by line. Every detail that had once supported the lie now strengthened the correction. Dominic settled early, relinquishing executive privileges and forfeiting equity shares in exchange for cooperation. His public persona faded almost overnight. Interviews stopped calling. Investors, cautious but pragmatic, supported structural reform under Elias's reinstated leadership. Lila avoided cameras entirely. Her plea agreement required testimony acknowledging fabrication under parental guidance. She began therapy under court recommendation, not as punishment, but as recognition that self-deception had consequences deeper than law. The miscarriage had been real. The manipulation afterward had been constructed. Distinguishing grief from guilt became her private battle. Margaret fought reputation harder than legal exposure. She attempted controlled statements, emphasizing family miscommunication and emotional misjudgment. But public trust, once fractured, rarely reseals neatly. Invitations disappeared. Charitable boards distanced quietly. Victor remained the most rigid. Even during formal questioning, he framed decisions as strategic containment, arguing that the company required stability and that Elias's obsessive focus posed operational risk. Yet under cross-examination, his timeline fractured repeatedly. When confronted with the recovered dashcam metadata and device access logs, his answers shortened. In the end, criminal charges for evidence tampering and perjury moved forward independently. The outcome carried penalties measured not only in law but in legacy. The day Elias's exoneration became official arrived without ceremony. A signed order vacated the conviction permanently, clearing his record as though those 3 years had never existed in legal documentation. But they had existed. And nothing erased lived time. He visited Oakwood once more, not as an inmate, but as a guest accompanying a reform committee reviewing evidentiary preservation standards. Arthur Penrose greeted him with quiet pride. Darius nodded from across the yard, understanding without words. "You finished it," Arthur said. "No," Elias replied softly. "I corrected it." He donated funding for independent digital evidence verification systems to prevent pre-custody tampering in future cases. Not charity, infrastructure. Because prevention mattered more than revenge. Neurodyne's headquarters underwent structural transformation over the following months. Oversight committees composed of independent directors replaced concentrated executive authority. All digital evidence processed by the company's systems now required decentralized authentication, a design Elias implemented personally. Authority could no longer be consolidated quietly behind closed doors. Rowan accepted a compliance leadership role, not as compensation for guilt, but as responsibility earned through risk. He moved into a modest apartment overlooking the river, rebuilding his own identity separate from the family narrative. Mara remained beside Elias, not in grand romantic declarations, but in steady presence. Their relationship deepened not through dramatic confession but through mutual understanding shaped by endurance. She had waited not for wealth or vindication, but for clarity. They spent quiet evenings walking along the same river where the company's first major investor had shaken his hand years before. The skyline looked identical, only perspective had shifted. One evening she asked, "Do you regret building it?" He considered carefully. "I regret trusting without verification." She smiled gently. "That's different." "Yes," he said. "It is." The final hearing regarding civil damages concluded with a settlement large enough to compensate measurable loss, though no calculation captured time. Funds were allocated partially toward legal restitution, partially toward reform initiatives. Elias accepted without triumph. He didn't celebrate. He didn't retaliate further. He stabilized. The media cycle eventually moved on. New scandals replaced old ones. Public memory shortened. But within corporate law circles and digital forensic communities, the case became reference, not for betrayal, but for systemic correction. Years later, during a keynote on ethical predictive systems, Elias stood on a stage he once would have avoided. Not a speech about injustice. Not a memoir of suffering. Instead, a technical presentation on layered accountability and behavioral anomaly detection, applied equally to cybersecurity and governance. He concluded simply, systems fail when oversight depends on trust alone. Integrity must be engineered. There was no applause he lingered for. He stepped away from the podium and into the quiet hallway beyond, where the noise faded quickly. On a winter evening remarkably similar to the night everything collapsed, snow began falling across the bridge where the accident had occurred. Traffic moved cautiously now, City infrastructure improvements had added reinforced barriers and clearer visibility markers. Elias stood there briefly, hands in his coat pockets, watching headlights reflect against fresh snow. He did not revisit memory for pain. He analyzed it once more for closure. My parents sent me to prison because of something I never did. The sentence no longer carried bitterness. The day I was revealed, he murmured softly to the empty air. It hadn't been the day of the accident. It hadn't been the verdict. It hadn't even been the courtroom reversal. It was the day he chose precision over rage, correction over confrontation, structure over chaos. The day he became stronger than the narrative designed to erase him. Snow continued falling. He turned and walked back toward the city lights, not as a victim restored, not as a son betrayed, but as a man who rebuilt truth so thoroughly that it could no longer be stolen. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.